in Pheasants Forever. I work based out of Ross County, but work in Southern Ohio. They called me in to talk specifically about native warm season grass forages, which is kind of a very specific part of the two previous presentations, but it kind of ties in nicely. It's more of a really specific topic for kind of a long-term solution to an ongoing problem is drought. But native grasses, we're going to talk a little bit about some of their benefits and drawbacks. But if we're successful, by the end of this, we'll be able to identify a couple of the native warm season grasses, get familiar with them, some of the ones Bob mentioned, actually all four of them, and how they fit into the greater grazing system, which is what Jared was discussing there. Kind of those growth charts throughout the year, they're really helpful in visualizing when forages are good to grow and when good to graze and when they're maybe not. Going to discuss some of the benefits and drawbacks to native grass forages. I think weighing out those pros and cons, like really beneficial for making farm decisions. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to end with some highlights of projects in Ohio. And the Rosses, I've worked with Dave Livin within RCS. They're going to share their experience with native warm season grasses here in the county. They've planted and grazed them. So the native grasses we're talking about here are switchgrass, big blue stem, Indian grass, and eastern gamma grass. And to be clear, here we're talking about perennial native warm season grasses. There are a lot of advantageous annual grasses, warm season grasses, that are just annual, that'll grow 1 year, that are also part of a lot of grazing systems, but these grasses specifically are perennial. So they're all very long-lived. They'll grow decades, many decades, a lot of times, if managed right, under good growing conditions. And they're all fairly tall growing, although in a grazing system, we're obviously managing that height to be vegetative and not producing a lot of seed heads, like was discussed earlier. They're all drought tolerant forages. Really, they developed under conditions that made them extremely resilient to environmental stress. Drought was one of them, grazing animals was one of them, and fire was another real big environmental stress that native grasses are really resilient to. So it really does it sets them up as a productive forage, because it makes them really be able to go through a lot of grazing or haying and still come back year after year and be reliable. And here's just an example of those four species, just different pastures throughout Ohio being grazed. So Bob and Jared kind of went through this, but I think it's worth mentioning that there's no grass that's an all-season grass, right? All grasses have their limitations, and recognizing the limitations of different forages that you all have on your farm make you a better manager. So this is, a traditional scenario where most of the farm is perennial cool season grasses. And what we're talking about today is native warm season grasses, how they can be maybe one solution or one option to provide solutions to summer grazing. Long-lived, drought-tolerant, and really kind of maximizing June, July, and August with the native warm seasons. And here's them kind of all together. Native grasses have extremely deep roots. 10 to 15 feet has been documented. And I think, in our heads we think that's like, oh, it's a great way to get water, right? They dig deep down to get water. But really it's an adaptation to deal with environmental stress, because that root system is basically, it stores a lot of carbohydrates, and when plants go through stress, those roots help that plant grow back. And since they're an extremely long-lived plant, they put a lot of investment into that root system. Again, another advantage to grazing though, to have something reliable come back year after year. Another benefit to native warm season grasses is if you're grazing native grasses in the summertime, or the same concept with annuals, you can stockpile your cool season grasses for the fall, which is when they're at their optimum growth anyway, once again. So here's a visual. Road crew came in and mowed, bluegrass and fescue dormant, right? This is in July. But the switchgrass, 2 plants of switchgrass came back and grew, 30 inches in probably a couple weeks or so. So that's, visually you're seeing the benefit of native grass. Having a feel of that stuff might be really nice. So a little bit about the species real quick, then we're going to talk about benefits and drawbacks. Switchgrass is really rapid growing. In fact, its rapid growth is a benefit and a little bit of a drawback, because sometimes switchgrass can grow so rapid that it can produce stemmy forage that's a little less palatable. But it does produce good forage earlier in the growing season. So we talked about that June, July, and August switchgrass. Some varieties will grow in May as well. One of the other benefits of switchgrass is sometimes our limitations are equipment, and switchgrass can be broadcasted or it can be seeded out of pretty much any traditional small seeder. Although it's still planted pretty shallow, it gives you more flexibility for seeding. And I have examples of all the seed and the grasses over there. But big blue stem's one of my favorites. Really fine leaf, extremely drought tolerant, and real palatable. A lot of times this will be one of the first ones cattle will go to and graze in a pasture. It produces pretty steady, a lot of varieties of big blue stem throughout June, July, and August. And its growth is a little less rapid and spread out. It makes really good hay, and it recovers well after making hay. I actually pulled some forage samples of big blue stem and Indian grass hay, and I brought those in. I thought you'll be interested in it. It also, you make hay in late June, early July is when it's at its optimum yield and forage quality, which is a little drier time of year to cut hay, instead of trying to rush it in May when we have a lot of wet weather in Ohio. Just kind of spreads out the workload if you're harvesting native grass hay. Yeah, same as any of these forages. The rapid growth is a benefit and a drawback. Keeping them vegetative is a benefit because it's better forage quality. But they want to form seed heads real bad, so it's hard to, sometimes it takes a lot of management to prevent the seed heads from growing. Big blue stem and has fluffy seed, so we can pass this around, but so it needs a special drill, a native grass seed box so that seed can flow. So sometimes getting a drill is a little tricky. I know around here, Fairfield, Hocking, Pickaway County, I mean, we're pretty rich with native grass drills that are capable of doing that. Indian grass has very similar seed to what you're looking at there, is also a fluffy seed that requires a special drill. Indian grass is another native grass. It's similar to big blue stem. It has a longer growing time. one advantage of Indian grass that Bob was talking about, those dry early falls, is Indian grass does mature. A lot of varieties of Indian grass matures into the late summer, early fall. So it's nice to have in a blend with some other native grasses, because you get the added bonus of having a later maturing native grass forage. Eastern yammergrass is another really good one. It, like switchgrass, it's actually even earlier maturing than switchgrass, so you get into that May time frame. But it also grows well throughout the whole entire growing season. Eastern yammergrass and big bluestem, cattle tend to eat it even when it heads out. So that's one of the benefits of it. Also, one of the native grass forages that cattle are drawn to first. But super long lived. The photo on the left, that stand is switchgrass and eastern yammergrass. I think it's about 35 years old. The seed's pretty large, so a corn planter is the best mechanism to plant that. Benefits and drawbacks. So we talked about a lot of the benefits already. Drought tolerant, native grass have that huge root system. They're built up to be really long lived. They produce high yields in a short amount of time, June, July, and August. We didn't talk about fertilizer. Native grasses don't require fertilizer, which is another cost savings. They take to fertilizer, but not the same way a lot of the forages that we traditionally use in Ohio take to fertilizer. Really, like, it is a way to make the most out of a forage that doesn't need fertilizer. Maybe you can put those fertilizer inputs on other parts of your farm. And then the top left is from University in Tennessee during a drought. The left pasture is cool season grass, fescue. The right is native grass forages. It's kind of a side by side. So some of the drawbacks of native grass forages are important to talk about. Native grass forages can be expensive, and with any new establishment, there's a little bit of a risk, right? You plant corn in the spring, there's a risk that it might not yield and you might not make your money back. So any new seeding has a little bit of a risk. Luckily, like the expense of it, yeah, a lot of times that they do a lot of economic studies. Generally speaking, they say that expense makes up for itself in about 3 years, 3 to 4 years. But really, like, using some of the programs that are available through USDA, I mean, those are really good opportunities that you might be talking about with your USDA office, that, you know, these are extremely long-lived practices, so in a lot of cases, they're practices that they like to see going in the ground. They perform best with good height management. That could be a drawback depending on the way you manage your farm. Obviously, Bob mentioned all the benefits of good height management and rotational grazing. Native grasses probably perform at their optimum in a rotational grazing system where you can manage the heights to suit, you know, the forages. One of the drawbacks on making native grass hay is adjusting the height equipment, or the equipment cutting height. So, man, ideally you're cutting native grass forages at 8 inches. And that is just hard with the way equipment's going, hay equipment. And so there is some really good resources on skid plates and putting boots and on hydraulics and such, but that is one of the biggest limitations, is adjusting the height. Can you cut native grass hay shorter than that? Yes, but then you get into the conversations that Jared and Bob had, where it's just taking that much longer for the grass to recover, the stand to recover, and just opens it up to other things like weeds and things like that. And then the last drawback is lack of forage during establishment. So native grasses take longer to establish than some of our traditional forages like, fescue, legumes, that kind of thing. Generally speaking, what to expect in a new native grass seeding is to have to probably not graze it the first year. So we're typically planting these things April and May, and that first growing season, basically like you're just managing that stand to be good long term instead of grazing it. That's one of the biggest limitations to doing these projects. The two on the top are at 1 year old, so those are early June of the year following establishment. The two bottom ones are actually both 5 months old. They're in August, September of the first growing season. So they can create a really good stand really quickly, but just not as fast as what we're used to. Yeah, just a summary. A couple commonly asked questions, then we'll get to some examples. How much native grass pasture compared to cool season grasses? Really, like I started this conversation, like this is a really specific thing, and it's not, a huge topic usually in planning a grazing system. Really what we're looking at is June, July, and August. So if you think about it, that's not a lot of percentage of your pasture to be converted to native grasses. I would suggest starting small if you're interested in native grasses. And maybe you're familiar with warm season annual grasses, so you know about the time that they grow. Maybe that's a good way to start transitioning. They have showed that like anywhere from 10 to 30% of your pasture in native warm season grasses can be productive. But where you fall within that 10 to 30%, I think depends a lot on your operation and how you use other forages to fill that gap. Haying native grasses, so we kind of touched on cutting heights, but the stand on the left, this is actually two different fields. This stand was harvested in, I think, late June, early July. It's hard to see from the photo, but I mean, it was probably 5 feet tall going into winter. But the stand on the left was harvested in the middle of August, this one right here. And really struggled, like it just did not recover for the winter. Some other like weeds came in, Canada thistle, Johnson grass came into that field. Small patches, but year after year can make a pretty significant impact. But the one on the left is, the photo on the left is like about a week or two after an 8-inch cutting, and it put on like inches of forage already since that cutting. Stockpile, native warm season grasses doesn't really make good stockpile. It's one of those things where it's like they're really great in June, July, and August, and that's kind of what they're limited to. Generally speaking, the stockpile, I say folks to just leave it, because at least that cover is there for to prevent like weed seed production and stuff. That you have the ground covered, and worry about it again when it's growing again in the early summer. Interseeding native grasses into cool season grasses. This works well for annual warm seasons. It doesn't work well for perennial warm seasons, mostly because the seed's really small. It doesn't handle competition well, and overall it doesn't work that well. So even if you did get it established, you would be competing, grazing the cool season grasses while harming the native warm season grasses, and vice versa. Not the best situation if you're looking to establish native warm season grasses. A lot of times after native warm season grass seedings, they become mixed and still can be productive. We talked about the drill. So some examples, I'm gonna flip through these kind of fast. We're getting kind of the end of the night here. But I thought you all would like to see, you know, other producers that are doing these kind of projects. It's kind of cool to see examples. Like gonna share some about his. This one's in Claremont County. This Claremont soils, really difficult soils to grow crops on, so this producer converted some of their crop, expanded their pasture. And so this was big blue stem and Indian grass. It's 5 month old stand. They actually did graze a little bit the first year. But this is an example from Meigs County, which really got hit with the drought. And he sent me a picture of grazing his forage, his native grass pasture this July. But so killed off this pasture in the fall, and then he actually planted a cover crop of, which grew really well. It was cereal rye and vetch, and he grazed that for a couple months before terminating it and planting native warm season grasses in April, May. The native warm season grasses, like I said, they're kind of slow to start, but with management, that was his stand the following year, and his cattle grazing it. Yeah, that's the seedling stand, but managing that seedling stand, clipping it, keeping the weeds out, sometimes doing an herbicide treatment, leaves you with a good stand the following year. And lastly, this is the stand on our family farm, converted like a high fescue pasture that never really produced very well to native warm season grasses. Managed that first year stand mostly by clipping, like foxtail and ragweed. We clipped it so the seed didn't mature, but the native grasses really took and were producing well that following year.
Is that big blue?
This stand? Yeah. This is a mixed stand actually, big blue stem and Indian grass are the two primary.
Yeah, so this is, Jason and Dave kind of made a believer out of me, because here on the left, the large photo is what my pasture looked like. I was pasturing cattle on that, and I'm a 4th generation farmer, and no one has taken care of our pasture through the years. It was just graze and rotate, don't put anything back in them. So I'm trying to change that attitude on our pastures, and well, here's a better one. That one was when it was sprayed, like kill down. Here's what it looked like, but I had some blowouts that I did some tile repairs in before I burned it all down with Roundup, but sprayed all that, killed it all. After I got my tile done, this top picture shows kind of what they were grazing in prior to rotating it. On this side of the fence row here is not planted in native warm season. On the left side of the fence and the other side of the watering system, that is all warm season grasses with the big blue stem, switchgrass, and Indian grass. So all of the things that they were talking about, and I did this in 22. So I did not pasture them in it the first year like was suggested. Did do a little bit of pasture in 23, but it was still coming up kind of light, and did some real quick pasture, maybe a week or two, got them in, got them back out. But what really paid off was this year in the drought, because I had pastures that were completely brown, couldn't pasture, and this stand looked, I don't know if you've got any pictures yet, so there's what I was grazing, and those are full-size cattle, you can barely see the back on in that picture over there. And this is what your blue stem, or I'm sorry, your big blue stem is that there gets, what's it get, 5 foot?
8 foot sometimes,
yeah.
yeah.
I had some that I'm walking through that's head height. You ever, never seen a cattle smile until you see them on one side of the fence and then seeing that on the other, so. Like I said, I was, questioning whether it was gonna be a good option for us, but through a drought season in July, when we had nothing else, this really paid off. Again, there's another, how tall, those grasses get, and the cows love it.
You said this is July, August picture this year?
I believe so, yeah.
So are you rotating through that, like putting the hot wire, somebody giving so much a day?
That's a
or is it-
4.5 acre field. Since we had the drought this year, I didn't do that, but hearing some of what Dave or Bob and Jason are saying, I have that watering system, so it might be a good idea to split it.
So they were in there
They-
for a week, 10 days, or?
So that 4.5 acres, I could keep them in there a little longer than that, probably 2 to 3 weeks.
How many head?
There's about, with calves, 30 head. So
30 pairs or 15?
15.
15 acres. So I probably overpatched it compared to what Dave or Jason would have told me, but we'll see what it looks like next year. I don't have a lot of rotational pasture, but I got some options where I could make some more, and this will probably benefit. And same pasture, that's our bull, so he's a pretty decent sized bull. He was happy that day. But yeah.
Yeah, so that's really it. This was just highlighting the Working Lands for Wildlife program, which some of these practices like that can look at this program with the USDA Service Center, in an NRCS office here. It's a good option, and really it's targeted on installing native warm season grasses for that dual benefit of being good for the land, but also being good for beef cattle production and for producers. That's all I had.
So we still have time if folks are interested in looking into that. We're taking new applications through January 31st. There's a couple different pots of money potentially that we could tap into, but there's a specific one that these guys used. They had to plant some native grasses in order to get that funding. So they converted a portion of their farm, but we were able to add on some fencing, that water line, and a couple other things. Now we have our traditional stuff too. You don't have to do any native grasses too, but there's a couple pots of money that you could potentially apply to, and you can use that first year conversion. If you apply this year, you're not going to be seeing until next year, because you got to kill it off in the fall to wipe out the competition, so you have a chance of getting the new stuff going, and you got to treat it real gingerly this first year. Maybe a late season graze, depending on the growing conditions. So we say that first year it creeps, right? And then it leaps.
Yeah.
So it's really till the second year till you see, so you saw his third year stuff, and that it was really going then for you, and even in this drought year. So
I called Jason and Dave both, and I'm like, I don't know if this is working, because there's just patches here and here, and there's dirt in between, and they're like, just don't graze it, just give it some time. And then I was amazed, like last year, how much it just proliferated, so.
yeah. So another thing to keep in mind too, we haven't done it too much yet, but I see a lot of potential. We have a lot of ratty fescue quote hay ground that we keep harvesting, then they come and say, well, why isn't this growing anymore? I was like, well, you're taking it all off, you're not putting it back on. What if you converted some fescue hayland to native grasses? Because you're not trying to make it in, May, you're making it in July, and like he said, it's drier then, tonnage wise, I bet in a few years you'll be making more off of one cutting of Big Blue switch than you will on even 2 cuttings of fescue. So that's another angle to look at too. If you don't have fence there, but you're looking for one big harvest, I've had a couple guys do that, and they came back to me and said, "I've never taken so many bales off there. What did you make me do?" I was like, "Well, you had a lot of production." So, and again, those deep root systems make them resilient, but that cutting height, you can't slice it off. You got to leave it 8 inches, because if you put all that money into it and then you cut it down at 2 or 4 inches, you might as well just give me the money instead, because you just wasted it all. So you gotta treat it properly. But we looked at some, if you guys ever go on 104 over to Chillicothe, right by the, right before the prison farm, the Adina place there. We went and looked at hay there, that's been in hay production there for a couple years. And they're doing a great job getting one cutting there, and even after a good cutting on a normal year, you might see 3-4 foot of regrowth after you bale that in mid-July. But again, that's good, pretty good flat ground in there. But just throw that out as another option if you're thinking about changing some stuff up. So I'll leave it there.
They make good hay.
Another thing that, I don't know if you mentioned or not, but you mentioned to me, which was pretty intriguing, is, you know, those root systems get so deep into those soils that you're getting nutrients pulled out of those soils that your cattle probably haven't, you know, minerals that they probably haven't been getting for years, and it's good minerals that come deeper into the soils.
I wish I could look at some of the more intense forage samples get from Dairy One and know what all those mean and how they're significant, but yeah, they definitely can pull